The first horror film I ever watched was American Werewolf. I remember the transformation scene vividly, and unlike my older cousin, who was traumatized by it, I loved it, and it got me hooked on the genre. I eat up everything horror, and do everything short of buying the Funkos, which in my opinion is a waste of money. Back when streaming wasn't a thing, I collected an entire wall of DVDs dedicated to horror films, from classics to foreign to cheesy movies. I just couldn't get enough of being scared. Now I read that horror stimulates the part of the brain that is primitive and hardly ever activated in modern times. Unlike our ancestors, we are on top of the food chain and rarely have to worry about being eaten by a saber-toothed tiger or being wiped out by the flu. Because of this, horror films, videos, games, and even things like roller coasters are used vicariously so we can experience the fear of nearly dying, but not actually being in any real danger. Haunted houses are a prime example of this. Every year, during Halloween, these places become extremely competitive with each other, all trying to be scarier than the others. The problem is that people are sort of desensitized from horror, and it's not just from movies or television, but from the nightly news and media feeds. Mass shootings, patricide, abduction, natural disasters, and so much more. However, for fans of extreme horror, this is a blessing. For people like me, we live for this kind of stuff. Over the years, I've found a few like-minded people online and became real-life friends with them. We have a group chat where we share movie and book recommendations. We call ourselves Gorehounds. While we were always communicating, it was during the Halloween season that we would share the scariest haunted houses to visit. Most of the extreme haunted houses were not advertised to the public. Most of them were illegally set up to make it feel more dangerous, and the really good ones were set up in places that were already creepy and riddled with a sordid past. A hotel where a fire killed dozens of people, a warehouse where a serial killer tortured the homeless, things like that. This year, a member of the group told us about a new place, a place that she claimed would be crowned the best of the haunted houses, Goose Creek Sanatorium. After a quick search online, I found that Goose Creek Sanatorium had a dark history. It was abandoned in the late 70s due to a fire, and since then it just sat there, gathering dust and mold. The most recent thing I could find on it was a short article from a small newspaper that said it had been recently purchased. Other than that, there was nothing. The drive there took a few hours, but we've driven more than that over the years in our search of the scariest place. Unfortunately, there was little to see on the way, so for most of the drive, I slept. When I woke up, it was nearly dark and the car was rocking on a dirt road that hasn't been maintained for decades. The trees that hugged the road covered the sky like skeletal fingers. It looked like the perfect place for a scary movie. Goose Creek Sanatorium was a large 5-story building that saw no upkeep in decades. Surrounding it was a black iron fence to keep its patients from getting away. Very little had been done to make the place spookier. The people who put it up knew this and didn't want to ruin it with many decorations. To me, this made sense. After all, a little salt goes a long way when cooking, and too much will spoil the meat. The same is true when decorating a place that is already creepy. The line to get in only had a few people in it. Like us, they were horror connoisseurs. We knew some of them from the other extreme, haunted houses we'd visited over the years, and this time we invited some of them to be members of our group chat. Like those other places, we had to sign a waiver. This allowed the workers to grab us, pull hair, and more. Getting into the main building required us to walk through a garden that was overgrown with weeds and littered with broken statues of angels that were covered with moss from years of neglect. Like the rest of the place, not much had been done in order to make it creepy. Before entering the building, one of the workers grabbed Rena, one of the founding members of the Gorehounds, and ran off with her over his shoulders. This caused everyone to laugh, including Rena, as she was being taken further away. "Bring her back when you're done with her, Aaron," Rita's boyfriend called out while laughing. At the entrance of the building was a so-called tour guide who was dressed like a ghoul who just crawled out of a grave. A man wearing a jacket and shorts asked why an extreme haunted house would need a tour guide, but the guide just smiled and said that everything would be explained later on the tour. He explained the history of the place as he led us through each of the rooms. Most of the rooms didn't have anyone jump out and grab us, because they didn't require any. The history of the building was terrifying, so we did not need to resort to embellishment. Not only were there mentally ill treated like animals here, but Goose Creek Sanatorium also housed people with tuberculosis, and they were equally mistreated. Whenever someone died, they were brought to the basement's crematorium by being dropped down a dumbwaiter made for corpses. According to the guide, the smokestacks that were connected to the crematorium in the basement would have to be cleaned out every month because the remains would stick to the wall. That job was given to one of the other inmates because of how damaging it was to people's lungs. If someone died while doing it, they would simply be added to the chimney's ashes. While others in the group thought that the story was bullshit, I believed every word of it because of the horrible things I discovered online about the place. After this introduction, we headed to the cells. As soon as we left the lobby, iron bars in the doorway dropped, preventing us from leaving that way. The sound of heavy, metallic clanging was deafening and caused us to jump out of our skins. The guide chuckled when Goose Creek Sanatorium was first constructed. The biggest fear was that someone would escape. That's why there are bars in each of the doorways and windows. That wasn't anything I read while doing my research, but it sort of made sense. After all, this place used to house the worst criminals and lunatics the state had to offer. In the cells, people were reaching out to us on both sides of the hallway, moaning and screaming. Some pulled us towards them, and we would do our best to avoid their hands, or just slap them away. While this was going on, the tour guide told us about some of the famous murderers who once lived here. The most famous of them was Solomon Gideon, who killed 13 people in a day. He called Goose Creek Sanatorium home for 10 years before the mysterious fire that caused the place to close down allowed him to escape. Where he went is still a mystery. I could talk for days about Solomon Gideon, but that story's for another day. While being told all of this, a man wearing a dirty surgical mask came out of one of the hallways, grabbed someone I didn't get the name up by their hair, and dragged him away. The man being dragged away tried to fight him off, but the masked man not only had the element of surprise, but he was also very physically imposing. Because of this, no one stepped in to help. All we did was look on helplessly. We all signed up for this, after all. As we left the cells, more bars fell, preventing us from leaving the way we came. Deeper into the bowels of the sanatorium, we came across what I assume used to be the mess hall. When we walked in, it seemed to me that the inmates had taken control of the asylum. Hanging from the ceiling was wet meat hanging on hooks and cages. Inside the cages were people begging for our help. The guide spoke over their cries and told us more about the history of the place, how the doctors were known to perform experimental surgeries. When someone in the group asked if they meant lobotomies, the guide smiled and said, while those did happen in Goose Creek, there were far worse fates. Rooms were constructed with the sole purpose of driving insane men sane. The idea was that if something could make a sane man insane, it could have the opposite effect. This included flashing lights, prolonged darkness, sensory deprivation, being wet, cold, and hot. The people who had to endure this were even starved, the guide said as we left. Again, more bars fell down, preventing our escape. And I would be lying if I said I wasn't scared by this. Now our next stop was one of the operation rooms where blood had been spattered all around, making the place look and smell more like a charnel house than a hospital. I didn't think much of this. After all, it isn't uncommon for extreme haunted houses to use ground beef and the blood that comes with it as decoration. The guide told us to look around, and that we would meet back up at the surgery room in 30 minutes. We stayed in small groups, and wandered around a little, all the while having our hair and clothes pulled by people wanting to be freed. Their makeup is Hollywood level, Andrew said, pointing out someone who looked to have been captive for weeks. She was so thin. I assumed that she was a recovering drug addict or a method actor, and her dirty white dress highlighted the fact that she was pale as a ghost. The more we explored, the less we saw the other groups with us. Occasionally, we heard screaming, but we couldn't be certain that it came from them or the actors locked away in their cells. After 20 minutes or so went by, I noticed that the guide was nowhere in sight. I was concerned about this, but the rest of the people in my group assumed it was just part of the show. He abandoned us so we would have to escape on our own, Aaron said as he started making his way back the way we came, forgetting about the iron bars. Making our way back to where we last saw the guide, we looked for an escape route. At the time, we were relieved. After all, up to this point, it wasn't overly scary. Now that we were left to find our own way out, we felt that it was about to get good. We spread out to look for a way out, but kept close enough to each other so we could hear if one of us called out. After a while, I came across a dark hallway that had 6 different directions to go, including the way I came from. Calling out to the rest of the gorehounds, we met in this grand intersection of hallways. Some of us wondered why the hallways were designed like that, but Andrew was quick to scout ahead and find a way out. Before he could open the door at the end of the hallway he chose, one of the women from the other group barreled past the door and ran by us. She didn't even try to stop or explain herself, and the look on her face was pure horror. Under usual circumstances, we would have followed her just as quickly, but we came here to get scared, so we went in the direction she came from. After all, we had to know what made her freak out like that. We couldn't see much in the dark room, but there was an echo and the floor was sticky. Somewhere close was the sound of shallow gasps. We had to feel around to navigate our way through. On the way, we got separated, made worse when some of the actors came into the room with night vision goggles and took some of our hands, as if they were in our group, and led us away from the others and the exit. By the time the few of us discovered that half the gorehounds were no longer with the rest, we were in the next room, a surgery room made to host an audience. The smell of fresh blood was unmistakable. In the middle of the room was the body of one of the people in the other group. She was tied to the operating table, and the surgeon who appeared earlier in the cells was standing over her. Some of us freaked out when we saw this, but Debbie assured us that it was all part of the show, that we were looking at a dummy, and the person we met in line was a plant to make the experience feel real. As she said this, I inwardly applauded. We all had experienced extreme horror houses before, but never came across anything like that before. In the distance, there was the sound of someone yelling over a bullhorn, "Stay where you are, don't come any closer," and more instructions. There were even a few gunshots. We all froze, wondering if this was part of the show too. If it was, it didn't fit the rest of the experience. The surgeon aimed his scalpel at us and warned us not to move before running out the door towards the shooting. Naturally, I don't listen, and went to look out into the hallway he went through. I thought this was all just part of the show. However, when the surgeon started stabbing the officers before getting gunned down, I knew it was real. After the raid, and the police took everyone's statements, we were let go. They promised to do all they could to find Rena and the others that went missing, but after 2 years, we don't have much hope in finding them alive. In the days that followed, details of what happened emerged. In the 10 days the haunted house was up, 36 people went missing, and at least 14 were murdered. The man responsible for the haunted house was best friends with the shady prison warden, and the two of them had a deal that the warden would supply prisoners to make the horror experience authentic for an unspecific amount of cash. Those acquired from the prison included 8 murderers and 10 violent offenders. The worst of it, though, was a known cult leader who would dine on the blood of his sacrifices and must have recruited the others. Why this person ever saw the light of day is a mystery to me. 7 of these people were killed in the raid, and the rest are among the missing, including the man who paid off the warden. Aaron killed himself a few weeks after that night. I think he blamed himself for laughing as they took Rena. The Gorehounds broke up soon after that. Nothing officially. It's just that we no longer update each other on horror movies or other haunted houses. I sort of talk to Debbie, but never about anything horror related. Most of the time we hang out, we silently fish or drink. I can't speak for the others, but I cannot bring myself to watch horror anymore.